Hello everyone. Hello to all participants of this webinar and welcome in today's session. I hope you're all having a good day. I am Alba Keita, the organizer of this webinar and the account manager for risk and management at PECB. Today's webinar will discuss the topic of risk treatment, costs versus benefits. In this webinar, the presenter explores risk treatment as a key process in risk management, the various options available, and how decisions are made on options taking costs and benefits into consideration. The presenter of this topic is Mr. Jacob McLean, the Principal and Managing Director of Kaizen Training and Management Consultants Limited. At the end of the webinar, we have question and answer session in where all your questions will be answered by the presenter. Accordingly, I would kindly ask you to write down any question you may have during the webinar in the chat box of your control panel. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy this webinar. Jacob, you may start the presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the webinar. This webinar is about risk treatment. Let me start with a brief outline. We will look at the importance of risk treatment in an effective risk management system. Of course, we know that the goal of risk management is ultimately to treat risks and to ensure that they are continually reassessed such that we have control being maintained. We'll also look at how we determine whether risks are to be treated. So the question is, to treat or not to treat? We look at the cost-benefit analysis and take a quick look at the ALARP principle. And yes, that acronym, we'll get to it. We look at options for treating risks, and then we'll have some concluding comments. By way of introduction, it has been said that there are 4 possible approaches to risk. The gopher approach, I'll explain that in a moment, the settler approach, the cowboys approach, and then the pioneer approach. The difference lies in risk awareness, risk assessment, but most importantly in the treatment or control of risks. So what am I talking about here? Look at this slide. We have the gopher. Now the gopher is an underground creature. It doesn't know what's out there and doesn't care to know. It stays underground where it perceives it is safe, totally risk oblivious. The settler, on the other hand, is risk averse. He or she knows that there are risks out there, but doesn't want to take a chance, doesn't want to chance anything. Then there is the pioneer, and we'll delay speaking about the pioneer for a moment. Let's talk about the cowboy. Doesn't want, rather he does what he feels, doesn't think or care about the risk. This individual is a risk taker, in a way oblivious of the risk, in a way just being plain silly. But the pioneer understands the risk, takes chances, but stays in control. And that's who you are. That's why you're listening on this webinar. You're a pioneer. You want to understand the risks. You want to be able to treat the risk, control the risk, so that you can maximize the benefits or minimize the threats. Let's look at the risk management process. Risk management speaks to understanding risks, the effects of uncertainty on objectives. In order to properly manage risk, we need to have a framework. This framework involves communicating and consulting with stakeholders inside the organization, external to the organization. It involves establishing the context. Where are we looking at risks? Internally, if it's within a department, a process, Is it the organization as a whole? What about the external environment? We take all of that into consideration. And then we do our risk assessment. Risk assessment involves risk identification, risk analysis, risk evaluation, and then follows risk treatment, most importantly, because risk assessment is not an end in itself. We assess risks, understanding likelihood and consequences, evaluating risk, determining whether they're high or low, evaluating with respect to our risk appetite, and then we determine treatment. And this, I believe, is really the heart of the process. This is why we do the risk assessment, in order to understand our risks, in order then to treat them appropriately. And of course, we constantly monitor and review. Let's then look at risk treatment in depth. ISO 31000, clause 5.5 speaks to risk treatment. 5.5.1, general, says that risk treatment involves selecting one or more options for modifying risks and implementing those options. Modify to whether or not we're going to modify likelihood or impact. Once implemented, treatments provide or modify controls. That's really the purpose of treatments, to provide controls or to modify controls. Risk treatment then is its focus. So having completed a risk assessment, risk treatment involves selecting and agreeing to one or more relevant options for changing either the likelihood or probability of occurrence, the effect of the risk, that is, the impact or consequence, or both, and then implementing the option or the options chosen. This is followed by a cyclical or iterative process of reassessing the new level of risk with a view to determining its tolerability against the criteria set, that is, company's risk appetite, in order to decide whether further treatment is required. So having treated the risk, there is an inherent risk that remains. That must be monitored. We do not treat and forget. That's never the approach. We constantly monitor and review. Let's then look at options for risk treatment. And I have here on the screen several options that we would need to consider. And clause 5.5.2 of ISO 31000 is a clause that deals with risk treatment options. We have several here. There's avoidance, and we'll go in that in a little while. There is increase, removal, changing or modifying the risk, sharing the risk, and then retaining the risk. Risk avoidance, let's look at that first. Decisions taken when risks are too high, so high that treatment cannot be contemplated. Decisions, avoid. The risk may be unknown or simply uncontrollable, in which case, again, avoidance is the best option. Typically, activities are cancelled in such risk scenarios. Take, for instance, the fact that it is known that a particular area is prone to earthquakes or flooding. The best option would be to avoid building your facility in that area. Of course, there are ways and means of mitigating risks. So we know that there are means of mitigating earthquake-related risks. So we ensure that we follow best practice in order to mitigate those risks. But depending on the nature of your business, you might want to avoid locating it in a particular area that is earthquake-prone or flood-prone. What about increase? let's look at this option. And this is where deliberate actions are taken to decrease the level of control of the risk or increase exposure. And you may be alarmed. Why would you want to increase risk? These actions that are taken to increase risks are predicated on the possible benefits to be gained. Hence, the idea here is to maximize or seize opportunities, literally to ride the waves. So, things are going well. Market is increasing for your product. What do? Ensure that you're able to produce. You may need to outsource production in order to ensure that you have enough products available to meet market demand. Risk might also be increased by reducing the level of controls where cost exceeds benefits. And we'll speak to this when we get to look at the ALARP principle. So here we actually are deliberately increasing risk by reducing the controls because it becomes cost prohibitive. Risk removal is another option. And yes, it is perhaps inconceivable that you can remove risk entirely. This is an unlikely option to exercise because organizations usually do not have the leverage to effect complete removal of risks. So yes, it may be possible to a great extent, but risk in some form or the other will remain. But you can remove a particular risk. For instance, if you use, let's say, ammonia in your as a refrigerant, as a primary refrigerant in your manufacturing process, you may decide not to use ammonia at all. That is removing the risk related to ammonia. But then it may not be possible given the scale of your operation. So you ensure that there are proper controls. You do a hazard and operability study. You ensure that proper controls are in place so that you can safely use ammonia as your primary refrigerant. In the case of unfavorable legislation, the organization may join with other entities in the particular industry to lobby government to amend or delay implementation of a particular legislation. And this has been known to happen with regards to environmental legislation. It may be that organizations are not in a position to cope with the changes required. So normally organizations would gather together, meet, and consider actions that they can take. They would lobby government to delay and or in many respects change legislation. This may delay or in fact entirely remove the risks. Risk modification. How do we go about this? There are really two options. We can change the likelihood, the probability that is, of the occurrence of the unfavorable event, or in fact we can increase it if we're looking at risk in terms of an opportunity. Or we may change the impact. Let's say, for instance, your product is really moving through the door. You don't have hands to sell your product. Then you can increase the likelihood by advertising. Yes, advertising even though the market is doing well. You can do this in order to ride the wave, to ensure that the product continues to move. On the other hand, you have to ensure that you are in fact increasing the capacity so that you can continue to deliver. So risk modification, changing of likelihood, or changing of impact, or both. The other option here is risk sharing. This involves engaging a partner that can manage the risk more effectively. And this is increasingly happening with business process outsourcing. Organizations are focusing on their core business rather than engaging in those seemingly peripheral activities that others can do more effectively. So sharing the risk, ensuring that they're able to deliver, but getting rid of the attendant costs and hassle by partnering. The decision is usually dependent on the inability on the part of the organization to reduce the risk to within its level of tolerability, that is, its risk appetite, lack of resources, or economic factors. So primarily organizations which find it more conducive to engage partners would do this. Manufacturing, the IT industry, and others. Risk sharing is the most popular approach when it comes to insurance. Organizations typically insure because there are levels of risk that they could not tolerate themselves. So what do? Insure. Of course, this comes with a premium. So you pay a premium to the insurance company who contracts to cover the risks. Retaining the risk is another option, and this is entirely dependent on the company's risk appetite. Different companies are comfortable with different levels of retained risk. The risk remaining after risk treatment is referred to as retained or residual risk. The level of risk that is retained, of course, depends on the organization's risk appetite. There are organizations that are prone to take risks because of the level of their appetite. There are others that are more risk averse. If the level of risk meets accepted criteria, further treatment is unnecessary. It is important that retained risk be documented, and there must be cognizance that it can include unidentified risks. So what do? Ensure it stays on the radar. We do not forget it. We ensure that there is constant monitoring and review of the retained risks. Let's now look at the balance that is required in risk treatment. We're looking at costs versus benefits. What is a logical, business-wise thing to do if benefits exceed costs? Continue spending. Ride the waves. So here we see a balanced situation. Benefit 1, benefit 2, benefit 3, all are indicating that market is increasing, opportunities are increasing, costs are lower. We just have two levels of cost. So continue spending. You can gain, you can benefit. However, on the other hand, if cost exceeds benefits, so cost exceed benefits here, as depicted, what should you do? Discontinue spending. And this will be brought to light in the next slide, which speaks to the ALARP concept. That acronym, ALARP, means as low as reasonably practicable. It's a level of risk that is tolerable and cannot be reduced further without the expenditure of costs that are disproportionate to the benefits gained or where the solution is impractical to implement. Let's examine this chart. To the far left, on the y-axis, we see risks. On the x-axis, we see costs, benefits. When there is zero spending or zero benefits, what do we see? Risk is high. Risk is high. As we begin to spend, so the spending line is trending upwards, you're expending resources, we notice that the level of risk is coming down. And it continues to come down as the spend goes up. Well, then there comes a point where further spending does not appreciably reduce risk. And in fact, cost becomes disproportionate. This is a point that is referred to as ALARP. At this point, it does not make business sense to continue spending. Now, this concept can be applied in any area in risk management, whether it is quality, food safety, health and safety, whatever area. This point must be determined as low as reasonably practicable. We're not required to do what I call gold plating. Here's another graphic that speaks to the ALARP principle. And here we have this upside down pyramid. At the very top, we have the unacceptable region. Risk must be reduced regardless of costs unless extraordinary circumstances apply. So here is where we don't want to be. Below that, in between the bold line and the line below the jagged line, is a tolerable region. Risk tolerable if all reasonably practicable steps to reduce it are undertaken. So this is an area of tolerability. And we have two comments here. Risk tolerable only if reduction cost is grossly disproportionate to gain achieved. The other comment, risk tolerable if reduction cost exceeds improvement achieved. Note those 2 points. Below is the jagged line is the broadly acceptable regions. You could literally close your eyes and accept risk in this area. You must ensure that the risk is managed to remain at this level. It must remain on the radar. We don't forget it. If we don't, this risk could eventually come to bite because risks do not remain static. We live in a very dynamic world where likelihood or impact is likely to change. Hence, we must keep focus. Monitoring and review is essential. A few comments about sensible risk management. Risk management is essentially a trade-off process, a trade-off between risk and benefits, risk and costs. Maximizing the use of controls means application of controls to ensure balance between costs expended and benefits gained by controlling the risk. This is the essence of risk management. Controlling risks, treating risk to ensure that benefits are derived while costs are kept at a minimum. Overspending on controls is what I call gold plating, which is incorporating costly features or refinements into something unnecessarily. Why gold plate? No benefit to be gained. The equilibrium point should be the aim. Spending too little is sometimes as bad as spending too much. And of course, there's a popular saying, you get what you pay for, but don't overspend. Balance is of the essence. To effectively treat risk, we're coming down towards the end, a plan must be in place. ISO 31000 clause 5.5.3 speaks to implementation of a risk treatment plan. The plan must ensure that there is justification for selection of the treatment option, and this should include the benefits to be derived, the expected benefits. That's what you're going to use to justify the particular plan. And then responsibility for approval and implementation of the plan. So we expect top management, senior management, to approve the plan because, of course, they're going to expend resources. They're going to need to approve the budget. But then there is some level where implementation has to be owned. Some person manager, supervisor, whatever level, must own the plan. A plan cannot be an orphan. It has to be owned by somebody. And then the plan must speak to the actions to be taken. What are they? When will they be taken? Resources required. Very important, including contingencies, normal operations, as well as contingencies. The plan must speak to the measures of performance, risk performance indicators, and of course, the constraints. There is a need for reporting and monitoring. The reporting frequency should be indicated. How is the monitoring going to be done? Is it going to be a monthly dashboard report? Is it going to be a weekly report? Is there going to be a meeting? Is it going to be transmitted via email? How is it uploaded to a website? How is the treatment going to be reported? How is the monitoring going to be done? And of course, timing. This is key. When will the action be taken? The timing, the schedule, and of course, indicators of priority. So the risk treatment plan must be comprehensive. It must be signed off, it must be approved, it must be owned, and then it must be actioned and reported. Thank you for participating in this webinar. I look forward to any questions which you may have at this time.
Thank you, Jacob, for this informative webinar. I would like to ask the audience to write your questions right now. In the meantime, I will start with the first question. The first question is, can we get examples for risk modification?
Okay, that's a good question. Modifying the risk. Let's consider, for instance, the use of a strong acid with respect to, say, cleaning in a manufacturing enterprise that uses acid in its cleaning process, in its cleaning in place process. Using hydrochloric acid, which is a very strong acid, would present a very high level of risk. The risk could be changed by using a weaker acid, acetic acid or phosphoric acid. A weaker acid, yes, it's still an acid, however, it's not as strong an acid. And therefore, by changing the strong acid to a weaker acid, we would be, in fact, modifying the risk. That's just one example in a manufacturing kind of setting. In a setting where we're thinking of human resources. If, for instance, we have a case where an employee is stressed, overstressed because of just having too much to do, we can consider engaging help. We could perhaps employ somebody else. We could consider utilizing IT resources in order to lessen what the employee has to do. Change from manual mode to more IT-based method of working. These are examples of modifying the risk.
Thank you, Jacob, for your answer. The next question is the following. Is risk treatment the same as risk control in regards to hierarchy of control?
That's another good question. It is very similar. So with health and safety, we speak about the hierarchy of hazards control or risk control, where we talk about elimination, substitution, administrative engineering controls, administrative controls, and so on. That's very analogous to risk treatment. There are different methods, so that's insightful. We use different language, but we're really speaking about the same thing. Mitigation, control, treatment, those are synonymous words.
Thank you, Jacob. The third question is, can you provide an example of risk pioneering isn't the same as the concept of pursuing opportunities?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that question.
Yeah. Can you provide an example of risk pioneering? Isn't it the same as the concept of pursuing opportunities?
I heard the risk, okay.
Risk
There's a word there
pioneering.
that Oh, risk pioneering.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that one. Yes, of course. That's the same, a similar concept there. You know, so you understand the opportunities, you understand the risk, but because of your particular outlook, you go after it. You stay in control because you understand the upside and the downside. You understand the effect of uncertainty, but you are prepared because you see the opportunity and you go after it, but you remain in control, which is most important.
Thank you very much. We have another question here. If a company's assessment already cover everything that knows can affect the business, why would it invest time in worrying about the unknown?
Well, we live in a very dynamic world. Things change. There are some risks which, for instance, we can think of the recent earthquake in Japan. They build really well. Their building code is best practice. They expected, that there might be earthquakes. However, they remain vigilant, and they make sure that there are plans to deal with such emergencies. They don't forget it, even though they have implemented the necessary controls. In a different kind of scenario, we ensure that we monitor and review. That's the essence of risk management. It's one of the pillars, monitoring and review. Being cognizant of the fact that there are factors out there which can cause a risk to change overnight. The weather, for instance, can change. Consumer demand can change. These variables that we do not control. And so monitoring and review, constantly focusing on a risk is key, because there is uncertainty. Unless there is 100% certainty, there is an element of uncertainty. And that is why it is necessary to keep focus, always monitoring and reviewing, never forgetting our risks.
Thank you, Jacob. We'll now be answering the last question for today because of the time limitation. We don't have time to answer all your questions. The last question is, what criteria do you use to measure cost and benefit of treating the risk, especially if the risk can result into injury as a consequences?
And that's a very good question, because when it comes to health and safety and environment, risks really present only the possibility of loss. So how do you measure, for instance, the loss related to someone dying? We think about reputational damage for the organization. We think about the loss, the hurt experienced by families related to the individual. We think about morale. And there is a plethora of risk related to, for instance, a spill. Deepwater Horizon in 2010. It's a very significant occurrence. People are still hurting. So yes, you can use the dollar sign, money, but then there is much more that has to be considered when we think about the cost. And those soft answers, rather, those soft factors, the reputation, the trade impact on the trademark, all of those are really inestimable when it comes to cost.
Thank you, Jacob, once again, and I want to thank all the attendees as well who have joined us today. I hope all the questions have been answered. I also want to inform you that this webinar is recorded and can be found on PCB YouTube channel and in our website pcb.com. Additionally, PCB appreciates your comments and suggestions. Thus, I would kindly ask you to write down your suggestions on the upcoming webinar topics in the question that will be shown at the very end of this session. Looking forward to seeing you all next week in a very interesting topic of building an organizational risk management culture. Until then, have a great week. Jacob, thank you very much again.
You're so welcome.